everyone. I'm Kate Elliott. Welcome to Narrative Worlds. Thank you for being here. And this is my fabulous guest this week, Zen Cho, speaking to us from Birmingham, almost halfway across the world.
Yeah.
I actually did the times for this so that I could get you and Tade and Aliette's coming up next year.
Yeah, it's a good time for us Europeans with children.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that I did, and unfortunately, East and Southeast Asia and Australia are kind of left out on this because the world is round. And if only the flat earthers were correct, it wouldn't be an issue. But again, facts get in the way. Okay, here's my quick intro. The goal of this series, some of you were with us last month, never mind, it's last year, I don't know.
What is time?
What is time anymore? Okay, this is Narrative Worlds. The goal of this series is to dig in to the idea of narrative worlds and the theory and practice of building them. Each month, a guest will join me for a dialogue on a specific aspect of world building. We'll talk for about 40 minutes and leave some space for questions at the end of the hour. And then I'll close the hour by reminding you of what's coming up next. There is an Ask a Question button at the bottom right hand of this Zoom. Please use that if you have a specific to the topic question only. I won't be looking at chat. I think Zen might be looking at chat. But so the only way you can ask a question is through the Q&A button. And my standard disclaimer, this series is not about a goal or a lesson. It's a discussion by professionals about their experience. There's no right answer, no secret handshake. If you hear something that's useful to you, that's fantastic. And if not, that's also par for the course. This is just an art and a craft. So let me reintroduce Zen, who has written Sorcerer to the Crown and the True Queen, both Regency era fantasies set not entirely in England. Spirits Abroad, the short story collection that, as I have told Zen on numerous occasions, got me through the worst bout of insomnia I've ever had, for which I will always be grateful. Yeah,
very soothing stories.
Yeah. No, literally, I would get up in the middle of the night when I was like waking up every hour, and it was the only thing that would relax me enough that I could, like my body could stop doing that. It was just fantastic. Anyway, that collection is being issued by Small Beer Press.
Yeah, next year.
Next year, with extra stories.
With new stories, yeah.
With news and yeah. The Hugo Award-winning novelette, If at First You Don't Succeed, Try Again. And a forthcoming novel. Can you tell me a little something, or that everyone, all of us, something about
Blackwater Sister? Yeah, well, because you're one of the few people who've actually read it.
I have read it.
Yeah, so that's so my career is completely like unfocused, I think, which is why I'm so particularly good. This is going to be such a good topic for me, because each time I sort of, except for those two books which were set in the same world, Sorcerer to the Crown, I've had to kind of rebuild a new world. So I haven't done series yet. So I think that's quite good for the topic. So Blackwater Sister is a contemporary fantasy set in Malaysia in 2019, so pre-COVID. It's about a young woman. She's spent most of her life in America, but she's now coming back to Malaysia with her parents. She's broke, closeted, and unemployed. And when she starts hearing a voice in her head, she thinks it's stress, but it's actually her dead grandmother. And her grandmother has certain plans which require her granddaughter, or the main character's assistance. And so that's kind of where it all starts. And it goes, as you know, Alice, all over the place. It kind of it's Gods, Ghosts, Gangsters, and Grandmas. That's my
Gangsters and Grandmas. That's absolutely it. So when I approached you and said, would you like to come on this thing that I was plotting together with SFWA, I asked you, you said yes. And then I said, well, what do you want to talk about? And you're the one who suggested prose style as world building. So I'm gonna I'm going to dump this on you. Tell me what you meant by that and by raising that as the topic.
Well, I guess, when you're reading a book, the primary way, I mean, the only way that you create a world in the minds of your when you're reading a book, the only way that that world is realized in your mind is through language, is through the words. And how you arrange those words matters. And it creates that world just as much as the content of the sentences, the shape of the sentences. I think this is something that really, that I don't know, I feel very strongly about, because I grew up in Malaysia, as you know, and as I read a lot of books by particularly British authors, American as well, Canadian as well, but primarily British authors. And often they were kind of older authors, kind of, like the quote unquote canonical, like I read a lot of Jane Eyre, I read Charlotte Bronte, I read a lot of like Jane Austen, I read a lot of like classic British kids fantasy, like Edith Nesbit and so on. I read P.G. Wodehouse. And the language in those books, obviously it's not exactly the same prose style, like, because they all lived at very different times, but the language is very different from the English. And I grew up speaking English. In my parents went to kind of British taught schools where they were taught British, in English. So although they speak various Chinese dialects with each other and with our extended, and American English is another thing altogether, right? So I think, to me, like, just living amongst all those different forms of English, all those different languages, like, to each language, each form of English expresses a world, expresses a mindset. So to me, like, that's almost your most powerful tool. Does the shape of your sentences, as well as what you say about your world, just how you say it, really matters.
One of the most interesting, the thing that immediately comes to mind is that when someone grows up in a monolingual world, there's a sense of a monolingual culture. There's no sense that there's that sense of what I would call the false universal. Everything. And this is actually goes beyond this idea of I'm going to put in dialects, not that dialects and pidgins and creoles, which also create, right? They also are part of the creation of a world. Why do people speak that way? How do they speak differently from people? And what do those things mean? But it's bigger than that. Can you talk a little bit about what might be the difference between a story? When you tell a school story, for example, in two different settings, how is the language how is the language being used to world build within those two settings in different ways?
Yeah, but I think it's a really interesting distinction that you make between, not just using dialect and dialogue, for example. I'm gonna say something that starts not really answering your question. I'll come back to your question.
Whatever. There's no right way. There's no right way.
What that made me think of, actually, is a really interesting thing I heard said about using dialect, for example, or creoles in dialogue, but say using standard English or a form of standard English in the narrative. So say you have your characters speaking, I don't know, Malaysian English or Patois or whatever, but when it comes to the narrator's voice, the narrative is in standard English. And there was a kind of argument that, that's kind of colonialist, because you almost treat the dialect or the patois, like, by the fact that it's only being used in the dialogue, in itself kind of marks it up as, I don't know, exotic or maybe not non-standard, because the narrative is the kind of standard, right? It's the kind of normative voice in the book, and then using that kind of variation in dialogue, it is almost kind of insulting to the variation, which is I think an interesting argument. Maybe to me, I feel it goes maybe a bit too far, but it's kind of an interesting one to think about. But I think the difference is, like, if you open a book if you open, say, like, let's say Charlotte Bronte, like a book by her, and you read a few sentences, like that's going to be so dramatically different if you open a book by like any like 21st century American author, and you just read, and it's technically the same language, but it's a different form. The sentences are just completely different. The rhythm is different. Um, and yeah, I think that's kind of where the difference lies. Like if you read a book, you almost know almost at once, like 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 a lot of like where the author is from in a way, and
Yeah.
where in time they're situated. I think that's kind of where the difference comes from.
I think that people forget sometimes how much we know about a book, from the rhythm and flow of the writing, and also not just the use of words, but what they feel needs to be explained, what they feel needs to be contextualized, what is ignored because it's assumed that the reader will already know it. And those things are embedded in prose.
Yeah.
What's put in and what's left out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting what you say about put in and what's left out, because kind of thinking about a genre convention, like, like it's things that people don't necessarily think about, like the extent to which emotion is described, right, expressly. Yeah. So like in SFF, we actually we're very much like, if someone's scared, we say that they're scared. We might not say she was really scared. We might describe her heart rate, racing, or we might say that like her palms are sweaty or whatever. But we tell the reader what the character is feeling. Whereas something like in literary fiction, a lot of the time, part of the kind of game is working out what the characters are feeling, and so you just have the characters that you have the dialogue, you have what they do, but the author deliberately doesn't tell you anything at all about what they're feeling. There's a kind of genre of New Yorker story that I really dislike that does this, where like everything is described except what the characters are thinking and feeling. Yeah. I really like it in certain, when it's kind of done a certain way, that like some of my favorite authors are very restrained when it comes to describing the character's feelings. Like I'm obsessed with like Penelope Fitzgerald, who wrote literary fiction, 20th century British writer, and she's very restrained, very British, but I think there's like a difference with like that kind of like the New Yorker story that I'm thinking of, where like you're told like what color the person's shirt is and what like color their shoes are, and like and kind of like what they say, but never what they think and what they feel. And I kind of feel though like books are about interiority, like that's the big thing that books have over other media. This is what Diana Wynne Jones said, that like what the characters are thinking and feeling. Like if you're watching a show, you have you're deducing it from the outside. But if you're reading a book, you're like you can be inside their head. That's kind of part of the power of a book. So I feel like I'm completely off topic now, but I feel like that
there is no topic. Story. This is the topic.
But anyway, kind of thinking about like what is withheld and what is told. I think even kind of in terms of genre conventions, that like differs. And to kind of bring it on to kind of a more practical working writer kind of point, like what that then makes it interesting, like if you want to give the reader a different experience, from I don't know, like if you're thinking, I want to write an epic fantasy, make it a bit different, like that's kind of one thing you could do. You could say, right, I'm going to adopt that literary fiction style of like writing. So all the things that will happen will be a big fantasy thing. The hero will venture forth in a pre-industrial world, etc., etc. And I can use that classic Campbell story arc, but I'm going to write it in such a way as though it's literary fiction. And actually, if you're a dude, then probably you will sell it as literary fiction and get the Booker.
What about character relationship? Because what this reminds me of is a lot of it is the writer's relationship with their own prose, and the writer's relationship with what they think they need to tell. If they think that the job of the person is, there's something in here about what we think the job of emotion is, right? So if I'm telling you a story, so we talk about the oral tradition of storytelling and how that has created a lot of narrative, but the difference with the narrative, the oral narrative, is that you have someone telling it to you verbally, which means they can imbue it with their own emotion. So I can say, what? And, no, right? But if I'm writing it, I could have what and no with no further markers. And we either have to really know how well these people through the world building, right? What are their different positions in life? How does prose tell us about what their different positions in life are? Or we have to append, like just stick on these, she shrank back, she lunged forward. I don't know where I'm going with this either. This is, to me, is a fascinating topic because I don't think genre talks about it a lot, even though it's done unconsciously. It's like, it's embedded in what we do.
I think, I think going from that, like, I think one part of the issue kind of talking about this is that it's kind of what you were saying earlier, that like not everyone can change their prose style, right?
Right.
So like I'm someone who like when I was kind of growing up as a teenager, I wrote a lot of fanfic, but particularly one thing I really enjoyed was pastiche. So I really enjoyed just like writing something in the style of. So I wrote like this is like the fanfic I always tell people about on like panels because I'm really sad I lost it. I don't know if I've ever told you about it, Alice, but
No.
I wrote like a Discworld fanfic about Legolas and Gimli in the Watch. So like Legolas and Gimli from Lord of the Rings in Ankh-Morpork's Watch, in Terry Pratchett style, obviously. And it was a great, it was this like, I like, although I say it myself, it was a great kind of like buddy cop kind of like comedy, and and they're like, and like what Pratchett's elves are like, so they're very scary and like they have a kind of a historic animosity with the dwarves, right? But like in Pratchett's world, like elves are kind of evil basically, and so Gimli's like kind of salt of the earth like member of the Watch, and he gets like given Legolas, who's newly joined the Watch, as his new partner, and he's really pissed off about it, and that's kind of where it starts. I wrote a little, I didn't write a lot of it, but it really annoyed me because like to this day I'm kind of like, oh, it's really good, and I wish I'd like written the whole thing and I wish I could find it again, because I didn't actually finish it, so I don't know what the ending is, but how did I start with that? Yeah, so like that was kind of like one of the things I did. I wrote kind of like different like canons in like say Terry Pratchett style, or I did like a couple of Regency versions of other things. I did like a short story, I think it was like set in the Good Omens world, but then like it was the style in a style of like a Rudyard Kipling short story. So one thing is like that, like one thing about it was like it's really fun. So it's not as, sorry, that doesn't sound as, it's not as like far apart as it sounds, because Rudyard Kipling actually did a story where, God, I wish I remember the title, but he actually did a short story about heaven, like the gates of heaven, but like as though it was kind of like run like a British bureaucracy. So I know, which is, in a way is kind of a cliche idea, but Kipling is actually like, although he was an imperialist, was very, very talented as a writer. He actually does make it really work. So it kind of worked with Good Omens. But so one thing about that is obviously great training for a writer, but that I think I kind of took into my pro career. So with like Sorcerer to the Crown, the True Queen, they're deliberately in this kind of archaic English, right? And it's full of these words that like are kind of like obsolete, and almost like people don't really use them, like thaumaturgy and stuff like that. And I relied very heavily in the Oxford English Dictionary, because I was keen not to use words firstly that didn't feel like they belonged to that era. So if like a word, like if the earliest time a word was used, so it's like 1840, I might use that, even though that was like 40 years after the time of my book. But if it was like 20th century, like no way. And yeah, so, and I used a lot of these like deliberately obscure words, but real words, because I think like real words have a kind of like meat to them. Like they have a kind of convincing heft, that that kind of made up words don't have unless you're really, really good at philology. So I think it's hard to kind of challenge unless unless you're Tolkien or somebody and like make up languages in your spare time. Yeah. But yeah, so I kind of brought that into my writing, but I know that like not everyone can do that, like because for example, like I'm very picky about the Regency romances I read. Like I'm a big Georgette Hare fan, but there's actually not that many Regency romance writers I can read because a lot of people get the writing wrong. Like I was watching, what's that show? Do you know, have you heard of it, Alice? Is that like lesbian in Yorkshire? It's like in the
Oh,
Regency
yes, I
period.
have. I have.
Gentleman Jack. That's what I'm
Yes,
talking
yeah.
about.
I haven't
BBC,
seen
yeah,
it.
series. And it's great. Like the lead actress is like she's just like perfect in the role. But my problem with it was like the script is just so, it doesn't bother to use Regency period language at all. So at one point, like there are characters who say, "Oh, I'm a big fan of your daughter." It's like they would never, like people that time would never have said anything like that. So like to me, it's like, what's the point of putting them in like, those like Grecian gowns and like, having them ride around on horses and like in horse-drawn carriages, and then just have them like be like, "I'm a big fan of you." Like what? Why would you do that? You've just broken my suspension of disbelief.
Because one of the things that happens when you pick up a book is you can, if I read Sorcerer to the Crown, which I have, I instantly know where I am on the language. And the language also tells me something about the relationships people have. It's a little more formal.
Yeah.
And when I read Blackwater Sister, I see something that it's a little, that now I'm in a different place. And so it's not just that there are cars and airplanes. It's that the way people are interacting tells me I'm not in that formal and older. It's in own way a traditional society, but the relationships between people, their interactions, it's got a totally different, the society has a different rhythm and flow, and it's reflected in the way it's written.
Yeah.
And that I think is something people can think about. I mean, how do you talk about writing pastiches, right? Using that as a way to train yourself to try in working art. Is that something you would recommend to people who are trying to see how prose style can create different worlds?
I totally, yeah, I would recommend that. And also, like, I think it's really fun. So, like, I would just recommend that as like, if you, like, like a writing exercise to just like, trick, like, kind of prompt inspiration. The way I do it is just like, it does require some time though. Like, it is to like, steep myself in like whatever it is I'm gonna write in. So like if I was writing a Terry Pratchett fanfic, obviously I read loads of Discworld. And if I'm reading like, so when I was writing Sorcerer to the Crown of the True Queen, like, I mean, this was hard to stick to because I spent so long, like, I spent several years working on those books, but like I tried to actually mostly read letters from that era, which wasn't difficult because actually you have loads of books from that period. You have loads of books, although they're not from that period, they're kind of around that period, and they're kind of about that period, sorry, and they're written like in a language that's really convincingly kind of, even though that's not the language they actually use, you kind of believe they did. So like Georgette Hare, for example, working the early 20th century, yeah, but you kind of believe in her version of Regency language, right? Because it's internally consistent. And Patrick O'Brian is another really good one. Like he was again working in the 20th century, but like he writes Age of Sail kind of adventures, and again he uses a kind of language that's like you kind of believe it, like it kind of fits, right? Yeah. And yeah, so there's loads of nonfiction from that era. Like people were just constantly writing letters and diaries, and there's like loads available. So it was quite easy to kind of steep myself in that. And I so how I do is like I steep myself and then you just give it a go. And I definitely do recommend it as like a way to kind of exercise your writing muscles.
Yeah, one of the other things that language can do, and one of the things that working in pastiches can do, can be having people think about as they're writing, for example, what kind of similes and metaphors and observations would be appropriate to the landscape you're working in. So if it's a desert story, you're not going to use a lot of ocean metaphors, and people aren't going to talk about sailing. And there's a deeper level there, both in terms of how people interact with each other. Is it a highly stratified society? A highly stratified society might have some formalism in the way you're telling it and in the way that you're talking about people coming into contact with each other. That wouldn't be so true in this dialogue between us, right? Where it's more informal, and it's reflected in dialogue, but it's also reflected in the choices that you're making outside of that. I remember reading a book where someone had done a really good job of someone's born into an impoverished desert community, and they had a very limited framework for how they could describe the world. And then it slowly expands as they move away from that framework. And it was noticeable because they would use only these very few, they just didn't have things to compare it to. Whereas if you're not thinking about that, similes and metaphors can be very indicative, I think. And that's something that is embedded in prose style.
Yeah, it's true. I think that kind of looking at it from the other way around, like that's really hard to do, I think, because like language is so instinctive, you know?
Yeah.
It's something I think about a lot. So like an example that I have actually, which is sort of like not directly connected, but is it's a book by a Malaysian author, but like a 21st century like contemporary person who's alive right now, and it's set in 19th century Malacca in Malaysia, and there's about a young woman who's grown up. She's had a very sheltered. She's Chinese. She's grown up had a very sheltered upbringing in a wealthy Chinese family. She's not allowed out very much. So she's just lived within her family, very protected. But the problem is like the prose, the language just didn't match, and like. I mean, this isn't really a prose issue, actually. This is kind of more of a world building content issue, because, she'd do things like she would, for example, meet a character, and he would hold out his hand, right? And she would be like, oh yeah, he was like shaking his hand like the British do. And I'm like, well, how often have you actually seen the British shake hands that this would be such an instinctive thought to you? It breaks that suspension of disbelief. But it's actually really difficult if you've for example, if like you're Malaysian and you've like obviously received lots of kind of the influence of like Western culture, you've watched like Western TV and movies since you were growing up, like it's very hard to then like throw your mind back and like kind of inhabit like say the world of someone who hasn't seen all this stuff, who isn't especially educated, hasn't had the chance to actually go out of her house very often, and wouldn't have encountered people from other cultures. That's very difficult, especially when you're writing in English and you're trying to convey authentically that kind of a mindset that doesn't have the West as its center. I think that's very difficult.
Yeah, and I think when people especially write secondary worlds, which is not entirely, I mean, obviously world building takes place in all fiction.
Yeah.
But when people are writing secondary worlds, I think that's a crucial aspect, which is what does my point of view character really know? And what is their experience? And how does their interaction with what goes on? I like to use the example of entering a room. Who you are and what's in the room is going to change how that scene is written every time. Yeah. If it's a hierarchical society and it's the king and you're a slave being brought, a captured general, that's going to be one thing. If it's a less hierarchical society and you have a petition that you're going to yell at this person, at this council member, that's going to be something else. I mean, and there's every possible, and all it is a door and an entry in a room, right? But every one of those passages as a writer, especially writing secondary worlds, well, and in this world too, right? We have to think about what do all those things mean and how are we going to talk about them, as opposed to just making them all the same, or assuming that they're going to be all the same, or assuming that everyone there has the same view of it that we as the writer do. We have to understand that the people in the story aren't us. And it's okay to write a book in which the people in the story are all you. You just have to be aware that you're doing that. If that makes sense. I don't want to get down on people who just want to write their thing, right? That's cool. But if you want to write something that's more secondary, so I don't know what that means. You got to think about your own assumptions, and then you have to think about your people's assumptions. I have been reading a book called Geek Sublime by Vikram Chandra. which is about coding, which I don't understand, but it's also about Sanskrit, the philosophy of grammar, and linguistics as invented, not as invented by, as invention is the wrong word, as understood by and created by all these Sanskrit scholars going back 2,000 years, right? And there was a passage that struck me, and I want to see what you have to say about it. So this comes from an 11th century theorist and philosopher, whose name is transliterated here as Mamata. I don't know how it's pronounced. And I'm going to read this kind of slow. So the denoted meaning of a word is one and the same for all persons bearing it. It's so that it is fixed and uniform. In other words, the sun has set is fixed, right? That's the denoted meaning. The sun has set. And then this individual goes on to say, but its suggested meaning varies with the variation in such accessory conditions as the context, the character of the speaker, the character of the person spoken to, and so forth. So for instance, the words, the sun has set, they might suggest the idea that now is the opportunity to attack the enemy, if they're addressed by the general to the king. They might suggest, if a confidant is speaking to a girl in love, they might suggest you should set forth to meet your lover, right? And this is not unrelated to the way we say that, like, I'm sad and it's raining outside, but it's also that, do you have any, I was struck by that sense in which we talk about words, but there's what the words mean and the suggested meaning of words. See, I'm kind of out of my depth on this subject because
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, go.
Well, I thought it was really funny when you said, I'm sad that it's raining outside as kind of an example, because it reminded me of an exchange I had with my partner, who, as you know, is British. And it was raining and we were going to bed. And I said, do you have that thing where in Malaysia, we have kind of a thing about when it's raining, it's really nice to sleep. Like, you know, if it's raining in the afternoon, it's nice to have a nap. And like, they don't really have that in Britain, because otherwise I guess they'd be sleepy all the time. But like in Malaysia, it makes sense because it's cool. Like it you know, it means that it's cooler than usual. That makes it easier to sleep, and it's obviously soothing. We have quite like loud rain. I would say British rain, like, kind of often is what we would call back home drizzle, which is like not real rain. Like, it's just like, it just comes down, you know. Whereas like Malaysian rain's generally much heavier. There's like thunder, you know, like there's a lot of wind. So there's much more noise kind of going on. He said that wasn't really a thing. So like, kind of, it's raining outside could have very different kind of suggested meaning depending on context.
It goes on to say that the theorist writing this has up to, like, just in the course of this one example, using the sun has set, they just randomly throw out 10 different suggested meanings. But that you would write that. I mean, one of the things about writing, especially in a secondary world, but also when writing in our own world, one of the things I love best is when you have built up your world and your characters enough that later in the book, you can drop in something like a phrase like the sun has set, and it means more than just the denoted meaning, right? And that the reader will get that without you having to say, and that made him mad, right? Yeah. I mean, because that's ultimately what, for me, part of what I'm going for as a writer is that my reader can come far enough in, that my prose can bring them, as you said, it's the interaction that I have with him. It's the only vehicle I have for them that can bring them far enough in that they can interact with it, not directly with the words, but with the suggestion that the words are creating in them about the world and the story.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because you kind of also have to think about, so so you can do that like yourself, right? Like by building, but that requires you to build the reader up. Like they need to kind of be with you in the course of the book, which I think I assume is why you write such incredibly long books. Because you have to make that world, you have to bring them along, right?
Yeah.
But also like I was thinking about like just to kind of like think back to kind of prose style as a kind of like core topic. It's like you kind of think about like when you're selecting a prose style, say you're deciding to write in a certain way, right? Like, are you going to write in a kind of, like, if you decide to write like a fairly informal way, or if you decide to kind of like adopt a more mannered style or whatever, you kind of have to think about like the extent to which your audience will have context. So like, Sorcerer to the Crown, for example, is set in a very in a setting that's very familiar to a lot of readers. Like it's one that's just very well covered in literature, and so, and thanks to your Regency romances, thanks to your Jane Austen adaptations, like something like a gentleman accompanying an unmarried lady, like that will have a certain meaning to people, and you don't have to over explain it. And all these kind of denoted meanings, you can kind of rely on that kind of meaning, that like on those kind of like accumulation of understood meanings, I think, that readers have. Yeah. One thing I kind of struggle with actually is because I write kind of like a lot of stuff set that like outside the West, say in Malaysia and in kind of like Asian inspired settings, it's kind of the extent to which I'm called upon to explain. I'm not a big fan of kind of like over explaining things, and I always believe in kind of having confidence in your readers, and the kind of books I like, like trust their readers to a certain extent. Not like they're not going to explain everything, and you might not even understand everything in the first go around, but there's kind of that tension there because of what's kind of assumed that your reader knows and what you think. My like the majority of my readers, I have a lot of Malaysian readers, but the majority of my readers are British and American, and so it's just kind of like working out how do I adopt the kind of style that I like, which actually kind of tends to understate things and under explain, but also kind of convey enough of these characters, the society, that people kind of understand when something happens what that actually means.
Yeah, I have a short, it's actually a novelette called The Queen's Garden. And I think about this because the beta reader, Roshida Ruiz, who's Filipino, beta read this story for me. So I wrote this story after I read Anthony Reid's Southeast Asia in the Age of Commerce, which I know you read.
I haven't read yet. No, that's the
you
TBR.
Haven't read it? Oh, it's who read it? Okay, so it's a fantastic book because he deals with history he pulls open a lot of social issues in a way that was quite illuminating to me. And so I was actually, when I wrote this novelette, I was talking to myself about what I'd learned in that book. That's where the story comes from. It was my way of processing it. But I began the story, and this is a little kind of a spoiler, but oh well, right? The story is basically about two young adult sisters. So they're about 18. So they've come of age in a kingdom that's in a setting that it's not Indonesia. I'm not trying to, because it would be in, 500 years ago, whatever. But it's actually set in the same world as Court of Fives, because there's an empire that's in both of them. And it's a story about how we understand women's place and men's place. So the men are the outward public face, and the women are the inward, seen to be private. That's often seen as that means they don't have any power. And in this kingdom, it's a story about how these two young women realize that their father is trying to take power away from them, which they have inherited, because they're really the inheritors of this, I'm going to say kingdom because I don't have the inheritors of the kingdom. It actually belongs to them through their mother, and that he's trying to take that away from them, and what they do and how they make that and how they regain power in to follow the tradition, right? So when I started writing it, I started it with, you know, Princess Anne and Princess Yara sat on pillows on the balcony, right? So this is your standard third person, limited, maybe tending towards omniscient. You know, they're sitting there, they're overlooking the hall in the palace and watching some envoys come in from this empire that's being belligerent, right? And I felt that wasn't quite right. So I felt like that there was a speaker, a narrator implied. There's always an implied narrator in every story. I felt that there was an implied narrator. So I backed up for one paragraph and I started using a more tale-telling voice, right? On the day their father, the king, gravely insulted the envoys of a powerful empire, his daughters awoke from their complacency, right? So now I'm telling the story. So I sent that version to Roshida. She wrote back to me. She said, well, who's really telling this story? And who is this person telling it to and why?
Yeah.
And that completely blew it up because now the story starts. Please sit down. The youngest girl's in front and the older on the pillows behind. Close the door so no one is distracted by the blooms and by the sunbirds and peacocks in the garden. Now, an individual is telling the story and it changed. The fundamental aspect of the story, which is that I wanted to talk about women's privacy being seen as weakness and lack of agency and lack of power versus public agency. That was that thematic sense. But now all of a sudden, the story became about the continuity and change and how continuity and change, how continuity happens. Who speaks to who? And what is it that this woman needed to say to these girls? And it is said in the palace. That, you know, so, and then at the end of the story, she tells the story and then she brackets it at the end by saying, this story is the first and most important lesson I teach you. And for me, it changed the story completely. And it was by specifically adding, not just the prose style of kind of someone's telling the story, but specifically setting the story with that bracket of, you can see this woman, this older woman talking to these girls in the palace who are the holders of continuity. And that tells you a lot about the world building of the story, right?
Yeah.
Now you know something about the world. And I don't know that I would have gotten that comment from, I have to say, that from like a standard American beta reader. I think that from Roshida, from a culture where oral tradition is how traditions survived, right? The Spanish conquest and the Catholic churches, what they did, that she saw that there. I'm not.
I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, isn't it?
What was I going to say? I was just like listening so intently. I haven't like prepared the thing I was going to say. Yeah, I think so I've really lost it now. But like oh well, what I was going to say is that I think just thinking about prose style as world building and what you do with your prose and how you world build via prose, like I guess one thing that I was thinking about is that for me it's organic. You know, it's not because it's something that comes down to the very way that you shape your sentences and the words that you use and the rhythm of the sentences is actually, to me, very difficult. Like I could not sit down. And writers come in all different kinds, right? So I'm sure there are people who can do this, but I could not sit down and write like a list of like, who is this person? Like what's important in their society? Say like where do they live? Like they live in a tropical country, so like surrounded by water. So what are the kind of words they're allowed to use? I couldn't really do it in that top-down way. It kind of has to come from the back of the head. But that's why I kind of drawn like existing influences. But like I find like if you just like change it enough, it just then becomes your voice, right? I mean, one thing with like Order of the Pure Moon, Reflected in Water, my most recent novella, My most
Oh
recent
yeah,
book.
I didn't list that one. Oh, it's so good. Anyway.
It's got such an incredibly long title. Anyway, but I think like one thing that I'm really proud of in it, and I'm not sure if it's really evident to people, is that it's kind of high fantasy, right? In this, I don't know, in the sense it's these kind of heroes, although I guess they're not very glorious heroes. I don't write very glorious heroes, you know. Mine are always very rooted to the ground.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of like pre-industrial, but then they have guns because that just felt right. Um, but that kind of like that kind of throw kitchen sink, you know, world building felt right for that story because it was inspired by Wuxia, right? Like, you know, these kung fu movies that, like, frankly, not very historically accurate. That's kind of part of the fun of it. And like the point is that excitement and the like romance of it and the like heroism, you know, and all this kind of thing, but also like tying it to a very like mundane kind of everyday like humor that I quite like. But the thing I was proudest of is that having this prose that to me kind of worked for a high fantasy setting, and like, you know, there's a kind of almost, I don't know, almost kind of like a muted grandeur to it, like a, you know, like a little bit, like, you know, it's quite sort of proper English, I guess, is one way to put it. But then the characters all are, you know, you've got a couple of educated characters, because so the POV character is educated. Sorry, I probably should have explained what Order of the Pyramid is about. So it's a novella. It's about a band of a company of bandits. They're not really bandits. The bandits are too grand for what they are. They're traveling contractors, and they're joined by a nun who's displaced when her temple is destroyed. And so she kind of goes off on this kind of quest with them to it turns out to sell some sacred objects, basically. And the kind of there's a kind of very kind of knights errant kind of wrapping around a band of people who are very kind of prosaic. Like, I wanted them to be feel like people you might know, you know. And there are a couple of educated characters. So the nun is educated. One of the bandits is educated due to his past life. But most of them actually are not educated. Most of them are kind of working class. And I wanted like, and to me, like, that's kind of a time when I was able to, in the dialogue, reproduce a voice that to me felt very authentically like, I don't know, like somebody who might, like a Chinese guy who's working in like a mechanic store, like, you know, like that kind of feeling, but also meld it with a kind of like high fantasy, daring do kind of setting, and that was all through language, like with the kind of more kind of measured sentences of the narrative, and then the dialogue I use essentially kind of Malaysian English, but it's like Malaysian English, it's just like a bit tweaked. So it's a bit tweaked for that fantasy setting. It's a bit more mannered than real Malaysian English, you know. But it very deliberately draws on kind of Chinese grammar, which Malaysian English to a certain extent does anyway, especially spoken by Chinese Malaysians. But it's got some interesting responses. Like somebody said to me, I don't know actually their background, or somebody on Twitter, and they were like, you know, I thought it was really interesting what you did with the dialogue. It really sounded, you know, it was like basically like Chinese translated into English. And she seemed to think that was basically what I'd done. And I was like, well, actually, I just wrote in Manglish, which is kind of my native language. So I didn't make it up myself. But the grammar is kind of modeled on Chinese. Yeah. And in a couple of places, I do this in some of my short stories as well, actually. I, for example, translate directly from a Chinese proverb into English, or I translate directly from a Malay proverb into English. And I also use words from those other languages when it kind of feels natural, it feels right in the dialogue. But yeah, so that's kind of how I achieved that. But like, you know, it's not like I sat down and said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. It's kind of like, I don't know, it comes from the back of the brain.
Well, and you're adapting the rhythm and flow, because it is very clearly got that fantasy grandeur, as you said, but it's also got an informality that Sorcerer to the Crown doesn't have.
Right, exactly.
And you read those two and they're completely different, and you already know so much from the language about the places you are. I want to quickly go, we've got two actually quite good questions here, and just enough time. David writes, sometimes a writer wants to create a wholly unique fantasy world, and sometimes a writer wants to send readers to a more familiar fantasy world. In other words, the example, a lot of Eurocentric high fantasy. As writers, do you make a conscious decision for where your story should fall on that spectrum? And if so, what's the risk benefit of each extreme between the unique and the familiar?
That's interesting. What would you say?
Yeah. I'm constantly making conscious decisions. And I'm also making a lot of unconscious decisions that I'm not aware of. I may never be aware of, or I may only realize when I finish the book, or when I see it come out, or when I see people talk about it. I do sometimes want to write something that I won't have to explain a lot of. One of the things about writing Unconquerable Sun, which is far future gender bent Alexander the Great in space, was there's a lot of stuff I don't have to explain. If I say they're sitting on the train, I don't have to tell you what a train is. You know, I don't have to describe what a republic and a queen is. I don't have to tell you what a marshal or a general are. I don't have to tell you what a spaceship is. And that's kind of a relief. There's things that I felt like when I wrote when I write in the Crossroads universe, there was stuff I felt like I had to explain because it's theoretically a completely separate secondary world with its own set of cultures and rules that they know, but which the reader wouldn't. So I felt obliged to explain more, which, as you know, really can bog down a book, and also isn't necessarily true. Jokes. Yeah. And it's also not necessarily true to the point of view. Why would they explain it?
No, exactly.
Yeah. So I absolutely make conscious decisions, and sometimes, like with the Queen's Garden, I wanted to process something I'd read, so I wrote that story to process that history work I read. The risk is that you don't examine your assumptions closely enough, and that you just repeat erroneous views of the world. There were no women who ever did anything in the past. You know, they were all pregnant, barefoot peasant women who never went more than 5 miles from their home. And the benefit is that, and there are other risks that you do something really horribly stereotyped, or that people reject it because they say, I don't get this. I don't understand. What does this word mean that you didn't put in italics, right? You should have explained it to me, or, and the benefit is the rich. There's nothing wrong with writing a familiar fantasy if that's what you want to write, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The benefit of pushing yourself is that it's a risk, and maybe it'll make you a better writer, and maybe it'll bring you joy and excitement and help you write the next book better. What do you?
I think my thing is that every writer should write what you're called to write, like, which sounds quite mystical, but I do get quite mystical about these things.
Yeah.
And and like, to me, like the like sacred charge of every writer is to develop your voice, right? And your voice is like, what is the story that is given to you to tell? That nobody could tell this story better than you. And so if it happens to be a familiar feeling fantasy, whatever that means for you, then that's fine. Just go and do that as hard as you can, lean into that. Where I think for me, actually, when I was reading this question, I was like, oh, well, I always want to write a familiar fantasy. So, because I like the way I work, I'm quite referential. So I think about other things that I've read, and often when I'm writing a story, I'm like, oh, I want to write something that gives me the feeling that this book gave me, But then I realized that, I was like, well, often then, like, I figure that what I can bring to this is kind of my influences. So, like, I might say, okay, I'm going to write. Sorry, I think I dropped out there.
You did briefly. You said you can bring your influences.
Yeah, so I might, for example, say I would like to write a vampire romance. So I'll draw inspiration in Twilight, but I'm going to set it in like a small town in northern, the northern part of Peninsular Malaysia. That like inherently kind of changes it and makes it like I guess unique, because like there aren't that many stories like that. So I guess that's kind of like my experience. I don't kind of like, it's a lot kind of conscious decisions, but I think the big unconscious decision is kind of like what story kind of calls to you, right? And like what kind of stories you are so drawn to that you're like, I want to make more stories that kind of made me, to make readers feel the way that I felt when I read this.
Yeah. That's actually very much why I write as well. March asks, this is great for books written to convey the feeling in the archaic. What about predicting future language and world building, or holdovers from our time projected into the near future? That's an excellent and very complicated question.
So I kind of feel, I feel like you're kind of, I don't believe anybody really can predict future language. I think that's a bit of a fool's game. Like, and I think you're setting yourself up for failure really if you try to do it in a sense of like, I'm gonna be like really up to date, because inevitably you're gonna be using things of our time that then like might sound really funny about like 10 years from now, right? Or 20 years from now. But I think the thing that works, and although we've been talking about historical examples, because Alice and I are both very inspired by history, and we tend to write fantasy that draws very heavily on history. I think what's true for writers who write historical fiction is also true for writers who write stories set in the future, in the sense of, if you can create a language that is consistent and believable, right, for your world, then it doesn't matter if it actually is actually true to life. It doesn't have to predict what will actually be spoken in the future. And in fact, maybe you probably want to avoid quite a lot of what is now, because like, it's going to be so much of our time, right? The things that we say now and the language. But if you can kind of like pull it enough away from what we say and how we think, that people really think, right, this is actually different enough, and this is actually how or I could believe that we will speak like this in the future. I think that's kind of how I would tackle it anyway.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think inevitably we write for our own time. We don't really understand the archaic past. We have fragments that we put together that we try to understand about it. And who knows, right? The near future, who can predict the near future, much less the far future? I think ultimately, as a writer, for me personally, I think about what I'm trying to say today. And I don't worry so much about whether I'm going to predict things, because I'm not going to predict things. There may be some things I get right, but overall, I'm speaking to an audience now. And in terms of future language, a linguist who really knew their stuff, like Tolkien, might be able to talk about what letters would change sound and what parts of speech would drop out. You could do that. And I think, didn't Ridley Walker, isn't that that it's written in this kind of supposedly, how the speech would change. So, but I'm not that linguist. So I have to say, I mostly talk about the things that I want to talk about in the book, and I treat far future as another fantasy setting. That's because I just think we don't know. And working too hard on it you're not gonna, what are you gonna get?
It reminds me of this anecdote that like Diana Wynne Jones tells in her book about writing, about like her son reads Rudyard Kipling's Kim, the novel set in kind of, it's basically British ruled India. And she found out that he didn't know it was basically like mimetic fiction, like he thought it was a fantasy, because it felt like a fantasy world to him. So I think that's kind of what I was thinking about. Like it works whether you project it, whether your book's projected into the future or projected into the past. Like there are certain trappings you might want to have to indicate to the reader that this is the future versus the past. Like you might have robots instead of like horses, right? But or you might have AI. Robots are kind of retro now, even, aren't they?
They are retro now, yeah.
But like I think what matters is like kind of being convincing on your own terms. It doesn't really, in a way, it doesn't even really have to match what's in our world.
Yeah, yes, I agree. And now we are out of time. I have 15 seconds. First of all, Zen, thank you.
Thank you.
From halfway around the world, technologies amazing. We are in the future. So first of all, this session will be put up on SFWA's YouTube channel in about a week. What's coming up next month is N.K. Jemisin will be joining me to talk about power and world building as power. I want to thank you again, Zen, for this is fabulous. Thank you to SFWA for making the platform happen. Thank you to all of you who showed up for the live video cast, and any of you who in the future may be watching this on YouTube. A writing date with Kat Rambo follows from 5 to 7 on the Nebula channel. And do you have any final words?
No, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all. December 20th, N.K. Jemisin. And I think that's it. That's it. That's our world.
That's all, folks.
Thank you.